if we need to return immediately, it will probably be for fumes, so smoke or fumes in the flight deck or in the aircraft, for instance. So if we're on fire and we can't put the fire out, we'll be immediate returning. And they didn't even know we had an engine failure. Like, that's how good the modern jets are.
He played a pilot that had substance misuse issues.
We don't need to get on the ground as quickly as possible because everything is contained and the aircraft can fly perfectly well on one engine.
Scott, how are you, mate?
Good, thanks, Chris. How are you getting on?
I'm just absolutely over the moon. Friends at home, this is why I started a podcast. I'm talking to an airline pilot who flies the Dreamliner, which is one of the big ones. And I get to ask Scott everything that I've ever wanted to ask an airline pilot. Can we just get straight into it, Scott? Emergencies, because you've had a few up there, haven't you? And on air crash investigation, that's what it's always about. You see pilots fighting to stop the machine smashing into the ground, and obviously on air crash without success. Over to you.
Yeah, I think when you look at programs like that, you think every third flight is an emergency of some sort, right? But the amount of major emergencies that happen are so minute. So I think the first thing I would say is that the amount of times where the aircraft is in any form of danger is just absolutely minuscule. Saying that, I did have quite an interesting period of my career where I probably went for about 8 months of having an abnormal amount of emergencies happen to me. And it was actually great. It was right at the beginning of my career. And I think when you look at it, you think, oh, how unlucky am I for having all of these emergencies back to back to back? And at the time, I kind of thought that. But looking back now, it kind of set the foundation for the confidence and the capability that I'm now able to go into the cockpit with and fly with. I fly a lot more relaxed now because of the emergencies I've had. I've had probably 2 or 3 of the most severe ones you can get, or in the most severe bucket. And I would preface it by saying even the severe ones, they're very, very manageable most of the time. So again, when we're in the front, we're training for the most severe things to happen. And so we're more au fait with those than the little things that you might not even know that goes on a day-to-day basis.
I'm going to come on and talk about going through the checklist, etc. I should point out, friends of home, if you're not aware, I'm got my private pilot's license, and that's the first stage of becoming a commercial pilot. So that's another reason that I'm really pleased Scott's joined us today. But yes, you've had engine failure.
Yeah. So I had a reverser unlocked indicator, which everyone is probably familiar that when you land and you see the engines, there's flaps that come out on the engines that reverse the flow of the thrust and slow the aircraft down. So when we were taking off, we actually had an indication that one of those reversers had opened up, and with it we had a lot of buffet with it. So when you have the two things, when you have like a physical sensation of we're feeling a bit of buffet here, and we've got this indication that the reverser is unlocked, obviously that can be one of the most serious things, because if you've got one engine producing thrust in one direction and one engine producing thrust in the other direction, you can quickly become out of control and spiral. So the procedure there is to shut the engine down as quickly as possible if you can confirm that it might be accurate. And so we were only at about 5,000 feet climbing out of an airfield. And luckily we were in the UK and we're at our home base. But the captain and I remember him looking at me and, you go through this procedure. So every single time an emergency happens or a bell or a whistle goes off, you have a set procedure that you just flick into. And this basically cages a chimp. It stops the startle factor. And so the first thing you do is you have a breath, and then you read what's on the screen. And then the person flying will normally say something like, okay, I have control, so that they're the ones that are running the show. And so at the time I was flying. So I said, okay, I have control. And then you, as you probably will know from your flying, you aviate, navigate, communicate. So our aviate part, flying the aircraft, is to make sure we can understand what the aircraft is doing. So what modes is the aircraft actually in? Like, what have we lost? Because if we've lost the autopilot and we can't see it up there, we then need to start flying the aircraft. If we've lost the auto thrust, then we need to be responsible for the thrust levers. So we have a look at what the aircraft is doing, what modes it's in, and then we say to ourselves, okay, are we flying in the safe bit of space? Do we need to stop our climb? Do we need to go divert somewhere else or head back to base like immediately? Or are we okay for the time being, just continuing on the cleared path that we're flying on? And then the final thing is, who do we need to speak to right now? And a lot of the time it's either a mayday call and then stand by for our intentions. And then it buys you some time so that they can start clearing the airspace around you and prioritizing you. But yet you can then buy yourself some time to deal with the problem first before then letting them know of their intentions. And that's essentially what we did. We declared a mayday. We got ourselves in a nice chilled piece of airspace. We leveled off. And then, we went through the initial stages to secure the engine, so shut down the engine. And then it's all about planning and getting it back in for a safe landing.
One of the things I like about commercial flying, or certainly flying the jumbos as opposed to the smaller craft, is it's like a systems approach, isn't it? It's basically managing different systems, almost flying from like a technical perspective, but with the ability, obviously, to get hands-on if need be. And I want to talk about that because there was that amazing incident where the pilot crabbed a 747 into a remote Second World War, was it runway on an island? And we'll come on to that. But what I wanted to ask, Scott, is in that incident where you realize it's an engine issue, do you always go to the checklist? Or is it some emergencies, like there's not enough time, you've just got to make a snap judgment or an accurate judgment and go for it?
Yeah, I think that the snap judgments will have been pre-briefed before we've taken off. So before we've even moved the aircraft, so when all of the passengers are getting onto the aircraft, we're briefing what happens, what are we expecting to happen if everything goes right? And then we're also briefing what happens when things go wrong. And we're looking at different scenarios. What are the worst scenarios that happened if we're on the takeoff roll? What would we do if this happened? What would we do if we got into the air and X happened? And so we will always brief that if we need to return immediately, it will probably be for fumes, so smoke or fumes in the flight deck or in the aircraft, for instance. So if we're on fire and we can't put the fire out, we'll be immediate returning, and we'll come up with a couple of scenarios so that in our head, when we see it pop up, if we think, that's one of the ones that we briefed, we automatically go into the B-roll of what we've briefed of, okay, we said we were going to brief to get back onto the ground, and this is how I'm going to fly the approach. And then we just need to confirm with ourselves, is that still relevant? Yes, that's still relevant. Okay, let's execute that then. And then we've already divvied up the tasks between us because we've briefed it before we get on the ground. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to almost empty and reduce your capacity bucket so that you have as much capacity as possible during those high workload times. And so, if we're looking to return back to the airport for any reason, then we'll have briefed the immediate returns. And likewise, if it's an engine failure, then we don't need to get on the ground as quickly as possible because everything is contained and the aircraft can fly perfectly well on one engine. I mean, believe it or not, funny story, but when we got onto the ground with this engine failure, we'd done all the PAs and we'd landed and we'd got onto stand, and the passengers, as they were getting off and onto a different aircraft, a lot of them were turning around to each other and going, why are we back at this airport again? Like, what's going on? And they didn't even know we had an engine failure. Like, that's how good the modern jets are at performing with just one engine. And so, yeah, we'll have pre-briefed anything that requires an immediate reaction. Everything else is all about, you talked about systems, like the most important system to manage is yourself and how you operate under pressure. And I guess that's the key, really, is to build yourself time in either on the ground or in the air so that you can make a more conscious and more informed decision.
What about Chesney Sullenberger? What do we think about that? I thought that's one of the coolest things I've ever seen.
I mean, yeah, that's when intuition and experience and just pure exposure and experience and intuition comes into play, right? Because I don't think that many people would brief what happens if we have a dual engine failure and both of our engines get hit with birds, because it is once in a million lifetimes sort of scenario. I mean, it's so unbelievably rare, and obviously we've got to manage what we're going to brief and what's likely to happen. So for him to do what he did was unbelievably good. And yeah, he had the conditions that go with him, and the atmospheric conditions, and the river was nice and calm and all the rest of it. But yeah, incredible feat, and yeah, one that I don't think we should take lightly.
He says, we're going in the Hudson, and the air traffic control says, I'm sorry. He's waiting for an airport, and he said no. He calls out a river, and the bit I loved about it is when he's made the decision to land in the Hudson, and he turns to his co-pilot and says, "Any ideas?" I just thought that was so professional. Maybe the guy's got a better idea than him. But he forgot one thing, didn't he? Do you know what it was?
Oh, I don't even know. No, tell me.
If he'd gone through the checklist for coming down into water, the last thing on it is there's a valve you can shut, and
ditching valve.
Ditching valve, and it makes the aircraft watertight, because by the time the last person got off, it was kind of coming up to their waist or something. But
I think I'd still give him a 10.
Yeah, not here to criticize.
And going back to that point, him asking that open question to his co-pilot, that is the sign of good leadership. It's never assumed that, right, I've got command, I'm doing this, I'm going to take control. It's all just like, what have I missed? What ideas have you got that I haven't thought about? Because 9 times out of 10, if you're flying the aircraft and your capacity is up here, the other guy's looking around with a little bit more capacity and probably has a good idea or a good insight that will add to your decision-making model. So yeah, really, really good question to ask, and one that if the guy's not asking that question, they're probably at max capacity or they're not great at what they do.
Yeah. Yes. You've had fatalities on board, deaths. How did that come about?
So that was quite an odd flight. That was flying back into London, and the chap that passed away, sadly, he was actually reasonably ill, and from what we heard, he was coming back to England to be with his family, and so he was traveling with a nurse with him, and he was actually in the front toilet, like just outside the flight deck. So if you can remember, there's like the flight deck door and then there's a toilet right next to it. And the first thing we heard was sort of middle of France. We got a phone call from the cabin crew saying that the elderly chap had basically passed out on the toilets and they were administering CPR to him. So with our little cockpit video screen, we can see outside into the front galley. And we could see that there were cabin crew around him giving him CPR. And their drill is to work on the individual and try and save their life until the point at which they're declared dead. And you can't declare somebody dead unless you have a specific qualification. And so, yeah, our duty as pilots was to get the aircraft safely on the ground as quickly and as expeditiously as possible. So we have a full procedure that we go into. And, luckily at the time, I think I probably diverted 4 or 5 times due to medical emergencies. And so in my head, I was just like, okay, I know exactly what we're doing here. So I was like, I'm quite happy to take command of this situation and divvy up the different responsibilities to everyone. And one person is essentially flying the aircraft as quickly as they can to a gate, so that they can slow the aircraft down and land safely. So you want to almost maximize expeditiously to a point where you can then slow it down and not cock it up at the end. Because if you fly so fast and cock the last little bit up, then you have to go around and you're wasting more time, right? So yeah, that was the name of that game. And we landed and pulled onto stand. And I remember just looking at the skipper when we were coming down the final approach, actually, and they were still working on him. And I remember from a previous incident that we had that the feedback that we got was, try and clear all of the exit ways for landing, because emergency exits, you might have one person that's in a bad way, but actually if you have an emergency that happens during that landing process, then that will block the exit for hundreds of others. So you turn a 1 fatality into a 100 fatality. So I remember looking at the skipper and saying, listen, I know this is a bit odd, but we need to put the gentleman in a seat and secure for landing before we actually land here. And so I can remember him pushing his way out of the flight deck door and putting the passenger up and getting him secure, and then everyone around him secure first. And then as soon as we landed again and we were off the taxiway, the cabin crew were basically back to work trying to save this gentleman's life. And so they did a phenomenal thing. For us as pilots, it's quite easy. It's just managing your emotions and managing a flight at a slightly faster pace, whereas for those guys, there's a lot more at stake, so to speak.
How was it for the people on board? Because I'm imagining it's probably the first dead body that, a lot of certainly young people had seen.
It was the first dead body that I had seen. And yeah, I don't know if because of the adrenaline that goes through your body when you're operating in that environment, I just remember sort of seeing them and trying to get the resolution solved as possible, try and get the right people on board, try and get it taken care of. But the passengers, generally speaking, what happens when that happens in the forward part of the aircraft is that they'll limit the visibility to it, and then they'll also disembark from the back. So that's what happened with us. They disembarked all the passengers from the back. So thankfully, a lot of the passengers didn't see anything, and so it was able to almost be managed a little bit more subtly. And
does the Dreamliner have a first class section? I mean, is it like curtained off?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so they have first, business, and premium and normal economy on the 9s and 10s. The 8s they don't. I think they just have business class. So this was on an Airbus, though. This incident happened on an Airbus, so it was a slightly smaller aircraft with less opportunities to do it. But the guys did an incredible job. I remember thinking, like, wow, you guys have phenomenal at the way that you handled that situation with really tight spaces. And they had obviously his wife and the nurse with them as well, and they were emotional. And I remember thinking, like, these guys are phenomenal at what they do when they need to be.
Scott, moving on. So there was a cracking film that was out, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. Can't remember the name of it. It was Denzel Washington, and he played a pilot that had substance misuse issues, and he liked to party, take his stewardesses back to his hotel, and it struck a chord with me because I've experienced addiction all my life, or all my adult life, and it was one of the things I had to consider when I was thinking about becoming a commercial pilot, which I made a decision against based on something else, to be honest. It was essentially I just wondered how much life experience I'd be missing out on if I was sat in a cockpit for so many hours. But going back to the alcohol thing, you've got long flights, and you get to the other end, you're checking into a hotel, obviously on your own. You're sat probably in a bar for long evenings. You know, it must become a problem for, I'm saying, the older pilots. It's a bit like in the military, drinking becomes a real problem, because when you get to sergeant and above, you have a mess. And so you can go in the mess at lunchtime and have a pint, and then of course that becomes having 2 pints. Then you maybe not seeing your family for a week, so you go back to the mess in the evening, and the same on a ship. And a lot of the older chaps develop a real drinking problem, but of course they're not in charge of an airliner. Can you enlighten us to anything in this sort of area?
Yeah, I mean, I must have been quite lucky, because I think the guys that I fly with, generally speaking, like in actual fact, all of them that I've flown with have been pretty damn good at having a cutoff point and being like, I don't drink past this point, because that's my own personal limit. And I think that is kind of the key, is like understanding your personal limit, because you have the legal limits. You know, you can't drink anything for 12 hours for 8 hours preceding, and you can't drink more than a tiny little bit for 12 hours preceding, and it sort of goes back. So there's black and white by law limits, but then there's also personal limits. And I think everybody that I've flown with seems to understand and have a grip of their own personal limits when it comes to having some beers down route, or, you know, having a good night out. Most people are generally pretty hard when it comes to, this is what time I need to be in bed to get this much rest to then wake up to fly and be at my best when I'm in the cockpit. So I think that from that point of view, it's quite nice to know that everybody has their own limits and their own time schedule that they're working to on that. But yeah, I mean, you fly with lots of guys that like going out for beers, and it becomes a habit that they'll have a couple of beers when they land, and they've got a couple of days down route or something. But it's for me personally, I've kind of knocked that on the head. I don't really drink at all anymore, and it's because, again, from my own personal point of view, altitude when you're flying obviously thins the blood a bit. It reduces your ability to get better. It reduces your ability to fight off diseases, and it reduces your resilience. So for me, I just think it's actually quite hard work to be dehydrated, set up at altitude, and then land, have a couple of beers, and then go to a hotel room that's got air conditioning, so more dehydration. It's not a good combo. So yeah, I think generally speaking, people are pretty good at it this time. But I, like you said before, you hear stories of back in the day, but it's I think it was way before my time.
Yes. And I've got a kind of sneaky feeling like the Russian pilots, and there's probably more stuff going on there than we're ever going to get to hear about. I've seen some interesting photos of the what do you call them these days? Flight attendants, isn't it? In my day, it was a stewardess, but now is it more appropriate to call the girls flight attendants?
Yeah, I think they change it every now and again, don't they? They seem to change it. I always seem to get it wrong. It's in flight crew, or something like that.
I saw, I think it was a YouTube video someone had posted, and there was some quite inappropriate pictures of these Russian pilots and all their flight attendants. Have you got a favorite destination where you get a few days off and you get the chance to travel, or just kick back on a beach or somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty cringy to say, but I guess for me, I quite like the change. I quite like being in different countries at different times of the year. And I guess that's the beauty of the job, is that you can kind of pick to be in South Africa during the British winter, and you can try and get a trip over to South America or the Far East to get a little bit of warmth. I'm someone who definitely likes warmth. And so in the summertime, there's different places that are just like become more and more popular with people because they're nice places to be during that season. And so it kind of changes. I love South Africa in the wintertime. I always feel like I'm winning life when I've got a bit of time in the sun, as opposed to everybody obviously being stuck back at home and being in the grey and miserable. So it depends. I'd say it depends on what season of the year it is, really.
And what are your favourite places? Anywhere you can recommend to people?
I mean, South Africa to me has a bit of everything. If you're someone who loves the outdoors, I mean, you can be cage diving with great white sharks one day, and bungee jumping, and doing a load of cool extreme sports one day, and then the next day you'll be in the winelands chilling out with a couple of beautiful wines, and then you'll go, it's one of the most incredible places actually.
Kruger National Park.
Kruger, yeah, safaring, one of the most amazing things you can do. You'd do well to get a safari booked in for a trip, for a work trip. They're normally not that long, but yeah, South Africa is really, really cool. South America's cool. Santiago, Chile. If you haven't been to Santiago in Chile, it's amazing. You can go up into the Atacama Desert, and it's one of the least polluted places in the world to see stars. And so you could go up there and just see the most incredible night stars, constellations. It's a phenomenal place and very, very special. I don't think there are too many places like that on Earth where there's not a million people there queuing up to see it or anything. So yeah.
I camped in the Atacama, and there's me. I just set my tent up, got in, I was getting some food on. Bloody truck pulls up in the middle of the Atacama Desert, and out steps a ranger. And he's just coming to check that I wasn't. I probably gave me some words of warning about you can only stay one night or something, or that's certainly how it is in our national parks here. But yeah, that was quite funny. They've got that funicular railway? Have you been on that one?
I haven't actually, no.
It's like a cable car, but it goes on a rail. One of those.
Okay. What in Santiago?
Yeah, I think it's Santiago. It goes,
I've been, up to the high point where you can have a look at the city.
Yes.
Yeah. That's very close to our hotel actually. So yeah, that's quite a popular thing for the guys to do. But it's one of those things that I love places, and it's a little bit like Costa Rica or somewhere like that. There is so many things for you to do there. In Chile, there you can be in the winelands, you can go to the beaches, you can do whitewater rafting, you can ride horses in the mountains, you can do amazing cycling, you can go and see the stars and the flamingos on the salt flats. It's one of those places. It's just like whatever you like to do, it's within an hour's drive of Santiago, which is quite cool.
Scott, there's two things I love to do because I feel utterly relaxed and just on top of the world. One of them is flying. As a passenger, knowing that I'm going on a trip, and it's, for me, it's just instant relaxation, which I don't get a lot of.
Well, why is that? Is that because you just get to unplug?
It's like, right. You've done the worrying. You've done is my passport valid? Do I need a visa for it? I've got maybe I'm traveling to 12 different countries. Have I got is my machete in my main bag, not in my bloody hand luggage? I'm exaggerating a bit.
It's not a problem a lot of us have.
No, I've always, because I've been in the Amazon a few times, have a machete and just got to obviously put it in your big bag. But then you think like, oh, have I got my penknife? Is that right? I've done that. Then there's a few other things like this. Then there's just the fact of getting away from this life, getting away from England and all the stresses of strains of work. And once you get on that plane, that worry just stops for me. It's too late now. You bought a ticket, you are taking a ride. There's nothing you can do about it. You are off on your adventure. All those preparation stuff is behind you. Sit back, kick back. Can I have a beer, please? Thank you. And it's great. I love it so much. And I'm going to come on and talk about airline food as well, because that's another thing that I absolutely love, which I know a lot of people will find abhorrent. The budget for airlines has changed a lot, hasn't it? In the olden days, as a pilot, I think you had an expenses account and I reckon they probably put you up in the best hotel in town. How is that now? What are the perks? What kind of hotels do they put you up in? And do you enjoy being in the hotel? Because, sorry, I'm not sure if I said my second favorite thing in life is staying in hotels. I don't care if it's like a travel lodge. It's like, this is my room, I can make a cup of tea and coffee. I'm easily pleased, Scott,
I feel like you should have made that decision to become a pilot, by the sounds of it. Yeah, I mean, you only hear stories about how good it was, but I think that the one thing I would say is that no matter how good the older boys are saying that their time was, the ones that are truthful still say they were still moaning about, so there was always still something to moan about, or something that wasn't great, or something that they weren't happy with. And so yeah, we look back and look at maybe their expenses that they used to get paid, or their pensions used to be obscene, like really really unsustainable. Now I guess it's more of a leaner, more competitive business model, which is fair enough. So it's not quite as glamorous on that respect. But one thing I would say is that hotel wise, generally speaking, they're pretty good. Sometimes they're phenomenal, and you really really get a treat. Other times you take them and that there's other things you've got to look for on that trip. But when you see somebody new, it kind of reminds you that every single trip has something good to offer if you want to look for it, if you want to be the person that looks for it. Or you can just moan about, oh, the hotel's out of town and you don't get this and the breakfast's awful and XYZ. Or you could say, oh, actually, no, this place has a really good this. And so it kind of depends on how you approach each trip. You can either get on board and be really, really looking forward to something that you haven't done for a while, or an opportunity that you don't normally get, or you can get on board and moan about the crap things that I guess are present in everybody's job. There's always crap in every job, and there's always good stuff.
Yes, exactly. I guess being a pilot, you're kind of part of an institution, aren't you? A bit like the military, blokes was always going to complain about something. Scott, just going back to the Luke, my manager, wanted me to ask you, didn't he, about the Mile High Club? If
I'd be a pretty short answer, I think.
You got no stories to tell us.
No stories, no experience, no anything. I think it's a myth, but
yeah,
I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that would challenge that.
Again, I think there used to be a thing that it was quite well known that the dashing pilot could score quite easily with the flight attendants.
It's a funny one, really. I decided when I started flying that I was never going to date or get with any work colleagues, and that was just a personal decision from me, because you hear so many horror stories, and if you want the out of me answer to that story, then you just have to look at how many couples are pilots and cabin crew. Like, there's a lot of people that are in relationships, marriages, that are pilots and crew. And I think the reason why it works so much is because it's a funny lifestyle to buy into, and not many people understand the lifestyle that you're involved in. And you can be away for 6 days, like intimately with a group of people, and then you're coming back for 3 days, but you're getting a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday off, where your other partner, if they're in a normal 9 to 5, are working, and then you go away again, and it's a very, very weird bubble to live into. And in terms of landing back at 9 in the morning and then going to bed until for a few hours during the daytime, and having to get your sleep here, and missing this and missing weekends, and it's a very weird bubble to be in. And so I think you see a lot of relationships because they understand each other. You're not getting in and saying, okay, you've been away for 4 days, here's this, here's that, all the rest of it. You kind of understand that actually it doesn't quite work like that. Like, you need to give me a bit of time to recover, or I need to give you a bit of space to do this. So I can see why it works, but for me personally, I just thought the cleanest way to go through life is to not look on that avenue.
yes, of course. So airline food. I was on a flight once, and I ate my meal, and the chap next to me had fallen asleep, so his meal just stayed on the tray, on the the pull down table or pull out table, whatever.
Don't say what I think you're about to say.
No, he woke up for a bit, and I just turned to him and I said, "Are you going to eat that?" And he's like, "No." I said, "Do you mind if?" He's like, no, go. So I ate my meal, and let's be honest, they're not the biggest meals in the world, but they're usually fine. I was just particularly hungry on this flight, and so I ate my meal, then I ate his meal, and then I saw the flight attendant coming down, pushing the trolley again. So I took the 2 trays and I put them under my seat, and then I said, excuse me, could I get one of those, please? And she's like, oh, sorry, yes, of course. And she gave me my third meal. That's how much I like airplane food. I just wondered, what's it like as a pilot? Do you ever sort of take your own sandwiches because you're fed up with that sort of thing, or does the novelty never wear off?
Yeah, I mean, there was a time in my life where I was bringing every single meal with me. So I was training quite competitively and I was on a really sort of quite a strict diet. So I was bringing like 3 or 4 Tupperware boxes per day of me being away with me. So I had basically a suitcase full of Tupperware boxes full of meals, all weighed out, all ready to go, which was pretty sad and pretty unsustainable as well. So now I think it's just a balance. Like I'm aware that the food on board the aircraft has an increased amount of salt and sugar in it, generally speaking.
Yes.
And it's the salt that kind of, if you're training a lot, then it's not going to harm you too much. But you could imagine it's like anything. You continue to eat the same thing with something as rich in salt or something like that in it day after day after day, then you just have to project what is the inside of your body going to be like when you're 40 and then 50 and then 60. So I kind of like try and play a long-term game now that if you're doing it once or twice a month, it's not bad. It's your body will utilize what it needs to, and it's absolutely fine. But I think if you're doing it on a short haul contract, for instance, when you're in 4 or 5 days a week, and you're eating a couple of meals every single day for 5 days, it's not ideal, is it?
No, I hadn't thought of that angle, to be honest. What kind of do you train a lot? Is it important to keep fit as a pilot? I mean, obviously, the better you look after your body, the longer you're going to be in the job.
Yeah, it's everything. It comes down to the amount of rest you get. I mean, especially when you're a long haul pilot, you have nights out of bed, we call them. And so if you can imagine, on one trip, you might get 1 day flight there, but you'll get a through the night flight on the way home. And so every single trip you go on, you'll have at least one night where you'll have the full night out of bed. So you can imagine keeping yourself up for a full night and then cracking on with the day again with maybe like an hour's sleep here, an hour's sleep there. And then having to do that every 3 or 4 days. And then obviously when you're landing in Japan, for instance, you're now on a massive time zone different plus 8 hours. Then 3 days later, you're in LA, which is minus 8 hours. That's a 16-hour time zone difference. And it puts a big toll on your body. And you only need to read the book, Why We Sleep, to understand the sort of effects that missing sleep on a regular basis and all of this stuff, everything that impacts health, it's when it becomes regular that's the issue. Like your body's pretty good at recovering. And I spoke to a sleep expert on my podcast about how we can recover as pilots or as people that have disrupted sleep patterns. And he said, actually, if you're getting a really bad disrupted night's sleep, your body is very, very good the night after at understanding what you need the most and dropping you straight into that stage of sleep. And so your body's really good at recovering from that missed night of sleep. It's just if you're a parent, for instance, or you're working shifts and you're constantly disrupting your sleep pattern, that's when it starts to become a little bit more problematic from a performance point of view or from a health point of view.
Scott, questions that I'm sure our friends at home would want me to ask you. Have you ever seen any unidentified flying phenomenon of any? I'm not necessarily talking little green men in saucers, but anything that couldn't be explained.
I think if I had, then I wouldn't be smart enough to know to know that it was. I mean, no, I've seen shooting stars and all the rest of it, but I think a lot of the things that I've seen that aren't aircraft have generally either been a weather balloon or a drone if you're coming into a busy airspace, So yeah, you can kind of see something whip by and think, what the hell was that? But chances are it was probably a drone if it was at a certain level so no, I mean, personally, if I've seen something like that, my brain has automatically decided that it's something that I know what it is. So I'd say no.
And just to finish off, because I wouldn't not want to ask you this. I'm just a great believer in dream big and never ever dismiss your own dreams. If the time's not right, just put them on the back burner and they will come true. And that's been my life, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I met someone at a party once. It was in New Zealand. I think we did our first skydive together, myself and this girl. And we went to a party after, and she said, we were both backpacking, by the way, I should say. And she said, "Oh, I'm a pilot." And just immediately, I'm fascinated. This is the funny thing about life. I've traveled 85 countries across all 7 continents doing crazy stuff, flying, skydiving, adventure in the Antarctic. Do you know, not one of my mates has ever asked me one single thing about it, right? Which I think says a lot about life. Me, I'm the other way, Scott, hence why I started a podcast. I find this stuff fascinating. I love to live vicariously through other people's lives. I don't even need to do it. Just tell me about it. That is great. But so, yeah, dream big. And so when she told me she was a pilot, and she told me a bit about the training and how you have to, radio into the different air traffic control when you leave one airspace and enter another and this sort of stuff, I thought, right, I've got to do that. I've got to do that. And when I got back to the UK, I picked the right time. I had a few quid in the bank. It didn't cost me a lot. I bought back in those days before the internet, it was magazines, flying magazines. So I bought a flying magazine, turned to the back pages, and there's all the classified adverts. And there was one there, Tradewinds Flight School, Florida. And it said, call this number in England, being an English magazine, right? So I called this chap, and he said, "Oh, hi, Chris. Yeah, I'm basically the agent for this guy. I'm this guy, Ernie, in Florida. He taught me to fly. If I run his English operation, just answering the phone, basically, pointing people in his direction, he lets me go over there every summer and have a few flights for free." And I said, "So how much?" And this was about 2005 time. And I think he said it was £2,700. Plus, obviously, I had to find the flight to Florida. In fact, I think I made it part of a round the world ticket. But so I went over there. He was an awful instructor, just absolutely. I kept smashing the landings in because I didn't know that you don't bring a plane in like the Dukes of Hazzard when they're jumping the General Lee and you come down like that. I just didn't know, Scott, right? And why would you? I didn't know. No, you flutter down, or you come down on a cushion and land on a cushion of air like a swan landing on a lake, right? So I'm smashing this plane down, and he's getting cross with me. I'm getting cross with him, and then it was another student, an Austrian chap called Appy. He said, "Chris, did he tell you to pull back on the stick?" I'm like, "No." He said, "No, me neither." He said, "I had to work." He said, you gotta, you gotta flare, you gotta flare. And then it clicked, and then immediately my skill level jumped up a few notches, and I could then come in, land on the rear wheel, Cessna. So it was a front wheel and 2 middle wheels, land on the middle wheels, wheelie down the runway, and then touch and go. And you felt good when you get to control a plane that well. There were other pilots there that I spent all my lunchtimes chatting to all the pilots of Learjets and all this kind of thing. And they're like, "Chris, get up there and stall it." I'm like, "What?" "Just get up there and throw it around. You'll work out." So what I'm getting at is, so I had to pay for a few extra lessons because he delayed me with this not teaching me how to land. So it cost me about £3,000 back then. One situation where I flew to an airport called Okeechobee, and it's one of these ones where it's not manned by air traffic control, or it only is at the weekend or something. And I actually landed there at night with my instructor, and you you click the mic button like 12 times or something, or 6 times, and it puts the lights on down the runway. It was just incredible. My instructor went, right, click your mic button, just click it 6 times. And I went, and suddenly the lights like Star Wars go do 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 right in front of you. It was just amazing. Anyway, one time I flew to Okeechobee as a solo. I was flying solo then, and I was practicing my landings. Did something really stupid, which was just a big learning curve. I thought no one was around, Scott. So I'm landing one way, spinning the Cessna around, and then just taking off the other way. The wind was fairly sort of, neutral. And as I did this about 5 or 6 times, and a voice came over my headphones. I can't remember what my call sign was. It was like, no, November 50 Bravo. Are you intending to take off in that direction again? And I was like, oh shit, there's other traffic. I was like, Roger, yeah, I think the wind's changed. I was like, I felt so stupid, but also a bit reckless, And when I turned around to take off to go back to Fort Pierce, which is where the flight school was, I suddenly realized it was dark. It just got dark. And I'm a student pilot. You're not supposed to fly at night. And I'm taking off, Scott, and I'm panicking. What do I do? Do I go back to Okeechobee, land and sleep in an airplane all night to avoid the alligators? Do I continue? So I continued. I saw the beacon of the airport, whatever the white flashy thing. I saw it in the distance. And as I approached, I gingerly got on the radio and I spoke to the tower, and he's like, yeah, sure, come in. And he gave me a place in the pattern. And then he came back on the radio and went, no, ignore the place in the pattern. He said, just come straight in for a heads-on landing. I'm like, whoa. And I did the best landing of my life. Well, my short flying life on an airstrip designed for like DC-10s and that kind of stuff, with all the lights down it. And I'm coming in a little Cessna. And the guy on the radio, because I think they didn't have ground control at night, it was only the tower, something like that. He got back and he said, yes. And is it the ramp where you park? Yeah. He said, your ramp is if you just and he took me all the way to the ramp. And I was like, yes. I thought I was going to go to student pilot prison, but
it's funny.
Sorry, go on.
I was going to say it's funny though, because I bet you did the best landing ever, because your mind was so full with, am I going to get in trouble? Oh, I shouldn't be flying in the dark. What are they thinking of me? Is anyone waiting for me? That you probably didn't even think about overthinking the landing, and so the landing just becomes so much more easier when you don't overthink. It's like anything, right? When you're not overthinking something, it's normally when you're at your best at it.
I was in ecstasy. I thought I was really in trouble, and I mean, I had flown at night, but obviously only with my instructor. And when he just came on and made no big deal, he didn't care. I suppose he didn't even know I'm a student. Well, of course he doesn't know I'm a student. He might have known from looking at the call sign of the Cessna that this is a student, but he was, and yeah, I was just so happy, Scott. That was great. But your story. And the other thing about getting an FAA license, so that's Federal Aviation Authority, folks, that's American, as opposed to a CAA, a civil one in the UK, is I've got my license for life now. So if I wanted to go next week and fly in America, all I have to do is probably, I think, retake a medical, show my license to the flight school. They'll probably ask me to do a check flight, or I wouldn't do it. I'd get more lessons, obviously. But technically, if I was up to speed with it all, I can just go and fly next week. And the American license, you only lose it when you don't pass the medical, basically. Did you learn to fly abroad, or did you learn to fly in the UK?
Yeah, so I did my PPL in the north of England, actually, as part of my university degree. And then I also did some university air squadron flying. So that was in the north. I went to Leeds University. So by that point, I'd already done a bunch of flying, got my private pilot's license, and done some military flying before I started my commercial license. And then the commercial license was a English-based company that did predominantly all of their initial flying over in New Zealand. So I did about 10 months of flying over in New Zealand in Hamilton. And it was incredible. It's very, very similar in terms of the weather systems that you have in the UK, but obviously the airspace is completely empty in like relatively speaking. So you had a really good big airport that you'd fly into. It was a great setup, and all you had to focus on while you were there is flying and passing a few exams. So it's great.
Yeah, I did my very first flight in the UK just as a taster. Before booking the course. But I used to think, my God, how, like in Florida, you get the weather every day. So you get bright sun, and at the end of the day, all the cloud heads start building, and that's when you've got to be on your toes. But to be honest, they kind of form a column. You actually can sort of fly around them. Not that I want to do that, but in the UK, was it hard to get the weather windows?
I think by the time, I mean, yes, when I was doing my PPL, it was tough. You'd spend days, you'd get up in the morning, you'd look outside and go, I'm not flying. But as all student pilots do, you still have to go there. You still have to sit around. You have to do your MET briefs. You have to do, plan your courses or plan your flight for the day. So you've done all the planning. You've got up early. You're there. And then you're looking outside and you're looking for a little bit of a break. And every 30 minutes, there's basically a report that comes through, a weather forecast that comes through that tells you what the cloud base is and what the visibility is. And you can kind of see, are we getting closer to going? So a lot of the times you'd get really, really close to going, and then the weather would go back again and you'd be back to not doing it again. And you'd be there for like 8 hours wired thinking, I'm going to go up in like half an hour when it gets better. And you never would. So yeah, God, you used to spend days and days just like not flying, which is pretty brutal. But yeah, once you'd got your initial qualifications, you then had to do your instrument ratings and stuff, and that was when you could go up in a lot worse weather, I guess, in terms of you didn't need visibility as such, or certain cloud bases, because you could obviously fly through it.
Is that terrifying though, flying through cloud when you can't see anything, just relying on do the instruments tell you if there's something coming the other way?
Yeah, so that's the main thing about the flying in instrument conditions, is that you will have instruments that will certainly tell you where you are a lot more accurately, and yeah, some of the systems, depending on how fancy it is, will tell you if there's other aircraft around, but yeah, generally speaking, you'll have a lot more reliance on your instruments than you are when you're visual flight rules, where you're just looking out the window and making sure you're in trim and making sure that everything is sort of set up and settled. Here you're making sure you're very much exactly where you want to be at the exact time, and everything is based on a completely different scan of instruments inside the flight deck as opposed to outside.
And one last question, Scott. What equipment did you fly when you did your commercial rating?
So I actually did a 737 course in the sim, which is what you call an MCC course, like a multi-crew course, which is the thing you do after you've got your main CPL, your commercial pilot's license. You then need to go and get a airline transport pilot's license, which is basically where you operate as a two crew. So you go from being what you do completely on your own, planning everything, naving everything, doing all of the flying and all of the sort of like navigation, to having a two crew operation where you're both sharing the tasks and feeding in with each other. So I did a 737 course in the sim, and then my first aircraft was the Airbus A320, and that was where my first job was. And then I've flew that for two different airlines before going on to the Dreamliner. So I've flown Airbus and Boeing.
And Scott, before we say goodbye, can you just explain and give a shout out for your coaching course?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for highlighting. Yeah, so my coaching course is essentially set up for people that had high performing careers where they had really strong identities, and they're looking now to make a transition, and they don't want this to be an average transition into just an average job. Like, I see a lot of people coming from the military, for instance, like a lot of officers that are transitioning, and all they're being told is go into London, get yourself a consulting job. And for people like us that operate outside the box a little bit more, you don't want to do a 9 to 5. You want something a bit different, or a bit, a bit of a different vision for your life. So I set this coaching up. I went and got trained by the world's best high performer, the high performance coach, Brendan Bouchard, out in the States. And then I sort of developed my own method for getting people to make really powerful transitions from high identity careers. So pilots, doctors, military people, and those that want to operate outside the box, operate above their average again, and transition them into thinking differently and going after bigger and better things almost. And so I use a lot of proven science from a lot of the high performance techniques that have been proven by the High Performance Institution, and then a bunch of my own stuff that I've developed. And that's where the podcast comes into. As I don't just rely on my stuff and the stuff that's out there in science. I then also speak to some of the world's highest performers in their field. So elite military operatives, special forces guys. We've had Olympic gold medalists. We've had Formula One drivers, CEOs, record breakers. Like the list goes on. We've got some truly incredible people, England rugby players. And so I get an insight from them into what helped them transition or think about life differently so that they could still continue to operate at their best.
Brilliant. And it's Performance Hackers, your podcast. We'll put all your links and your social media below, Scott, so people can catch up with you or book you for coaching. Mate, it's been absolutely brilliant. I've thoroughly enjoyed our chat. Stay on the line, Scott, so I can thank you properly. But on behalf of the podcast, just massive thank you for coming and sharing your story and your experience.
Man, great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
To our friends at home, if you could like and subscribe, click the notification bell, support more podcasts like this. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Much love.